Hello, and welcome once again to a special bonus episode of the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And today we have with us our good friend Ned Raggett. Ned Raggett is a librarian and a freelance music writer whose recent essays have appeared in outlets like The Quietus, The Wire, Shuffle, Cobas, and on his lovely and free-to-follow Patreon, which we'll have a link to in the show notes. But he's also one of the hosts of the podcast By the Bywater right here on Megaphonic, which looks at all things J.R.R. Tolkien. His work is Inspirations and Impact, Creative Interpretations in Other Media, Languages, Lore, Rip-Offs, Parodies, that musical about the anything he and his co-hosts think is interesting. And so, of course, we had to invite him on to talk about Return of the King and maybe about all of the Lord of the Rings in general, now that we've wrapped the whole thing up. Ned, thank you for joining us.
Hi there. It was interesting hearing someone else read out the intro for the episodes there for once instead of me.
Thanks so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Oh, man, where should we begin with this? I mean, I assume you emerged from the womb clutching a copy of this book. How did you first encounter Lord of the Rings and Tolkien in general?
Exactly how it happened. Well, first off, I'll say that if my colleagues on the show have presented on bonus episodes for Fellowship and Two Towers as well, so you can get their origin stories too. And they're also in the first episode we ever recorded for the podcast, but the short version for me is a simple one. Basically, it came down to the Rankin Bass Hobbit, which was first broadcast on American TV in late 1977. I remember catching it at the time. I think. I was probably, I don't want to say a little too young for it. I'm surprised I maybe stayed up as relatively late as I did. It was an early evening broadcast still, and it was on a Sunday. I mean, school day was the following day. You can't have that. But any event, that is the seed of it. I remember both reading my mom's copy of it, which I still have around, a couple of years later, and then getting more and more into it and being very familiar with that. And then, as I still am very sadly amused by, I essentially had the story of Lord of the Rings spoiled for me because Rankin Bass did The Return of the King, just The Return of the King, in 1980, which I also saw and memorized. And was like, oh, okay. So by the time I actually read Lord of the Rings itself, I'm like, oh, I kind of already know how this ends. Although they did a variety of very, very notable changes, shall we say, to the source text. So there was plenty that I was able to take on board when I read it for the first time.
But that's so neat because it's kind of like you got to know the Lord of the Rings story kind of the way people would get to know, I don't know, the story of King Arthur or some other kind of legendary figure that is not as a canonical version that's in a particular book, but just like a story cycle almost?
Yeah. No, there's something to that. And I was also aware of the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings, which essentially adapted Fellowship and Two Towers, almost you could say by accident compared to the Rankin Bass one. That's a whole tangled story I won't get into. But I think I did see that at some point before I also read Lord of the Rings. I'm pretty sure of it. So yeah, I sort of backed into the story. I do have a very distinct memory, though. This is something I don't think I've talked about on the main program. I could be wrong. This would have been after the Rankin Bass Return of the King came out, and I had seen it, and I was interested, and I had, again, read The Hobbit. So this would have been when I was living here in the Bay Area, but not in the city. I lived up in Mare Island, which at the time was a fully active and had been for many decades Navy base. My dad was in the Navy, which is right next to Vallejo, California. And we would go over, my mom and I and my sister would go over to the Vallejo Public Library quite a few times. And I remember, and I would have been, 9 around this point. And I remember seeing a copy with it was one of the authorized paperback editions from the 60s, the second edition essentially of the book that Tolkien had approved of, and with its very distinct artwork. I do remember checking it out and sort of attempting to read it, but I was a little too young. And also, I was starting with The Return of the King, which is sort of like, when you're plunged 2/3 of the way into the story. So I vaguely have a memory of starting to get the sense that not really was going like, what's going on? And things like that. And I also vaguely remember just flipping through the appendices as it happens and remembering the detail about Gandalf returning and being on top of the mountains of Moria and being there as sort of like, oh, wow, what a weird image, and things like that. So those stuck in my brain. But But it wasn't until the end of '83 when I'd asked for and received a copy of properly, this time the full story, in paperback and read it very obsessively. So in those post-Christmas days, I have a very distinct memory of that, reading late into the night and going, oh, okay, it all makes sense now. And it all kind of progressed from there.
One of the things I'm struck by is I think there's probably a lot of people who encounter Lord of the Rings at a certain point, in teenage years and whatever. And I don't think it's everybody for whom the book becomes just a part of their life permanently, but for some it does. And I wonder what the difference is. What are the people who, dip their toes into that world and are like, I'm never leaving it?
That's a fair question, and I don't have an exact answer. There is the canard from Paul Krugman, which I'm going to misquote, talking about the Lord of the Rings and Atlas Shrugged, and talking about how, again, I'm misquoting, paraphrasing here. The idea says, oh yes, one's the story about being lost in a fantasy world where everything comes through, and the other one is Lord of the Rings. But so and if the idea was it was actually broken down that way, I could sort of get it. But as we've pointed out, especially in our episode on Silicon Valley and Tolkien, which came out earlier this year, there's a lot more crossover between those worlds these days than we'd like, frankly. So, but it's a fair question, and I'll throw in some comparative examples. It's what's the word I would use? Immersion, maybe sort of a strange way to think about it, but you can also argue self-immersion. But I will say that at around the same time, I was getting a greater sense of and taking a deeper dive into any number of other fictional science fiction / fantasy worlds that were out there, which by that point had also developed their own particular mythos and sort of deep lore one way or another. The difference being a lot of these authors were still writing and creating new books, and Tolkien himself was no longer doing that. So around the same time, I'm also starting to get very interested in Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Rider books. I'm getting interested in Frank Herbert and Dune. I had already read, oddly enough, one of the more famous, not the most infamous, late '70s Tolkien knockoffs from Dale Ray, and that would have been at least the first book in the Thomas Covenant series by Stephen R. Donaldson. I got around to Terry Brooks later. Oof. but with all these other things I mentioned, with the slight exception of Dune, I mean, I am still interested in that. I've been enjoying the new adaptations. Lord of the Rings is the one was sort of like, no, I still have the books. In fact, I still have much newer and fancier editions of all these books, whereas all the other ones I left behind. So why Tolkien above all and beyond that? I mean, I don't want to get into sort of weird essentialism, like, oh, clearly it was the best. It's like, that's begs the question, why does one think it's the best? For me, I would have to make it more equivalent to something like, why do I still read Peanuts by Charles Schulz? That may sound strange, but keep in mind that his universe, you could say, was the one I got into the most when I was a very young kid. I mean, there's photos of me when I'm 3 or 4 and I'm clutching like these Peanuts books and I was already watching specials and things like that.
Parenthetically, me too, totally. I was obsessed with them for like 5 years. It was the weirdest thing.
Me as well. I was a huge Peanuts kid as well.
Rightly so. And I would say that the reason why both last, for me in particular, and there are many other factors that go into this, I would say is that anytime I re-encounter them, I see them through new eyes and pick up new nuances that I hadn't sensed before. And sometimes they're historically situated, things I didn't get. I mean, as I like to joke, for me, Woodstock was always a bird. So if we're talking Peanuts. But, sometimes things hit with a new relevance or new affect with time. I told the story on our episode when we discussed Jackson's version of Fellowship of the Ring. The short version of it is this. After 9/11, but before Fellowship came out, I reread Lord of the Rings, as I put it, one last time before the movie would take over my brain for a while, which it did. And the sequence where Frodo is like, what a pity that Bilbo didn't kill Gollum. And of course, Gandalf's students were probably pity. It was pity that stayed his hand, pity and mercy. And I remember thinking, I need that to be in the movie. And it was. And it was one of those things that in that historical moment, that line hit me in a way that it had not hit me before. And so these type of emergences, you could say, every time I re-encounter the text, it's been a couple of years since I did a proper reread, are things I look forward to.
I'm really struck by the ways in which for you, Lord of the Rings is already, even before the first time you read through the text, kind of mediated through other ways you'd gotten the story. And then there's just sort of, you're so sensitive to and conscious of the multiple different versions, whether they're adaptations in film or adaptations, textual adaptations or parallel fantasy narratives that owe something to Lord of the Rings. I'm so interested by that. I wonder if it also takes you into like realms of fan fiction and things like that. In other words, what does the world building look like when it's a multiverse, when it's many, many, many worlds that you're drawn to?
I think there's a danger is not the word because I don't see it as such, but I think there sometimes is there's an understandable, and I would say I sensed this when I was younger, idea that the real world is boring. I want to escape into all this. Is maybe the easiest way to put it.
Totally.
Yeah, it's sort of like this idea going like, people talking about their annoying day-to-day existence. I don't care, and all that. And again, this is coming from the point of view, speaking as someone who's a very, very, very smug and hardly worldly teenager. Keep that in mind, and I'm not saying I've improved since then. It's more like I like to think I've learned a bit much more along the way. So there is that. Now, I no longer dwell in those realms, so I'm thankful for it. But there's something addictive to the idea that the human mind can conceive of things that are not real, that can be creative, that can do things in much different ways than we can actually see and observe empirically, for lack of a better term. How this impulse plays out now in terms of creative literature and other things I encounter in art and creativity is, I think, much more obviously a rich tapestry, especially since, as again, with time, given my historical place and situation and what I was essentially socialized in some degree to read, but which I was also choosing to read, is getting beyond the idea of just like, what do a bunch of white guys of a certain generation think, and that's where the range of possibilities, whether it's in film, whether it's in graphic arts, whether it's in, of course, music, whether it's in many other things, sort of like, okay, stepping outside myself and stepping outside things that I'm quote unquote supposed to like or purported to like or would be slotted into liking. It's like, no, try more. And that's my exhortation to myself, as opposed to me, telling anyone else what's to do. It's just a reminder that you can do a little more. So the idea of falling into something where I say I would only have been on that path this entire time and basically just, living solely for say fantasy and SF broadly and all that would be, I would find that intellectually barren. I would find that something where a lot's being brought in, and I think the field is much more expanded than it ever has been in a long, long time for a lot of different reasons, many of them extremely good. So there is that. So this is not me being dismissive of the now. It's more sort of like, if I had been there, I could sort of see I'd be very, very crusty, and I'd be very annoyed at all the newer voices coming in if I had stuck with that. Whereas the path I ended up on, it's more like, oh man, bring it on, No more of the knockoff trilogies, please. So things like that.
I was really struck by what you were saying about that openness to the different voices and that kind of diversity of responses. Do you mean like diversity in terms of like different kinds of people, like different backgrounds and all that kind of stuff, like the surprising responses and reworkings and, whether it's explicitly adaptations or parallel fantasy narratives? Is that what you're talking about?
To a degree. I would say it's, I don't believe in essentialism in this regard because I think that's very limiting. Rather, I think it's the idea, however, that people who have gone through very particular and different experiences will bring certain things to bear that others may not due to their own particular experiences. That might be the sort of like most neutral, but I think fair way to put it. And that, of course, can encompass a lot of different realms and different things. The fact that, for instance, Tolkien clearly drew on his own wartime experience in World War I shows that here was somebody who was shaped by that situation and acted as he did. Something that he himself not only spoke about in the introduction to the second edition of Lord of the Rings, he was very clear about that, but which further research and knowledge and letters and biography has really delved and drawn out more since over time.
But like getting out to like contemporary responses to Tolkien, one of the things that really freaks me out, and I'm sure you guys have talked about this on By the Bywater, is the ways in which there are people who are, how can I put it, very open and creative and living in ways that are really pushing the boundaries the way in which our world can be, who love Tolkien. And then there's all like kind of extreme reactionary
Oh, yeah.
perspectives. I'm restraining myself from like going too far here, but people who inhabit either a tremendously neoliberal and cynical kind of perspective on the world. I'm thinking of, businesses like Palantir or Anduril and, the ways in which the Tolkien universe is very much part of that world, that terribly exploitative world.
Again, that was our Silicon Valley episode, straight up, was very much talking about that.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear that one. But then there's also like people who are a very particular conservative Christian, I think often quite racist Tolkien lovers. And it fascinates me that it's a book that inspires this incredible divergence of fanishness.
Yes, and I can think of other examples of other things as well, thinking about transmedia in particular, but not just that. I need not name names. I think we can all imagine a few. But you can argue, you can be very sort of like, both sides it and say like, well, this is a sign of good literature.
Well, it's a sign of an incredible level of flexibility, right? And that is a book that opens itself up to a really wide range of readers. One of the things we talk about sometimes, me and Chris, is like this idea of great books. Like, what do we mean by that? And we try not to, fall into the kind of simplistic great books, canonical, famous books kind of thing, but rather great books being books that are really elastic and really deep and really sustaining, and people respond to them, and all kinds of crazy stuff comes out of them that you could never predict. And I feel like Lord of the Rings is totally great in that sense.
I mean, I think it was Ari Fleischer, George W. Bush's Creature of a Press Secretary, who I want to say it was him around the time of the Iraq War. This is a couple of years into it. And it was also in the wake of, again, the Jackson adaptation. So by that point, the basic story had reached a moment of cultural commonness or ubiquity, maybe is the one I'm looking for, and knowledge. People knew what you were talking about. Chris Kattan can appear as Gollum on a break in the Super Bowl, and people know what that is, that level of things. And if it was Fleischer, he said something along the lines of, again, it's like, what we're doing in Iraq, it's like Sam staggering through to get to Mount Doom to see this thing through. It was like something, yeah, exactly. It was something completely like, what? And it was one of those things that was sort of like, no. At the same time, if you're talking hero narratives, if you're talking the idea of like, faith to see things through, etc., things like that, why wouldn't something like Lord of the Rings respond to that? And again, as you said, there's, flexibility is a good word for it. People bring what they see to it. And remember, people think of themselves as the heroes.
Of course. No one wants to be the bad guy.
Yeah. The bad guy is what you read into it. So, and as much as anything else. And if it's something where elements in Tolkien's story are more questionable in that regard, and yet so fit with one's own prejudices, well, there we are. And that makes talking about him and his work complicated, but something that is worth the engaging in turn, which is what I think we like to do here. Your point about it, conservative Christian thing, I think there's been a really heavy push in the last, I'd say 10 years, for a lot of writers who are working very specifically conservative Catholic points of view, to the point of at least a couple of imprints that are almost wholly dedicated to it, who are basically trying to fully reclaim something that Tolkien himself was very clear about. He always considered the word Christian, and he said at least at one point, he says, well, I consider it Catholic. Why? Because he was a Catholic, and it was very much shaped by his experiences there. It reduces a lot of what's going on, his complexities and thoughts about what exactly he was creating, and how he measured that against what we consider to be the prime creator, who was very much not him, is a very interesting tension that plays out arguably throughout his life. But it's something that, again, he would have on the one hand, said like, oh yeah, no, this is what I'm doing. On the other hand, he would have seen some of what was being argued from that point of view and from the writers be like, probably not, guys. He would have had things to say.
Yeah, I know, that's way interesting. I mean, there really is a sort of a sacramental quality, and particularly a huge focus on ritual, right, throughout the Lord of the Rings. I can totally see where that reading comes from. So, we're talking about adaptations and different kinds of responses to Tolkien. So I have to ask the question, in the Peter Jackson movies, not including the Scouring of the Shire, what do you think?
Oh, you mean them not including it at the end?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a loss. Bluntly put, it was more of a loss than removing the Tom Bombadil chapters easily, which is something that nearly all the adaptations have done one way or another. The only one I can think of that actually kept Bombadil in was the terrible late 70s American radio adaptation, which you don't want to hear that. So,
I just have to say for the record that I'm a huge Tom Bombadil fan, and yet I recognize the difficulty of the adaptation. I get it.
Yeah, the closest I think I've gotten to a good adaptation, although there was a separate but related BBC version that went back and sort of did that chapter separately from the BBC's own version. That would take too long to explain, but that's there. Is probably Andy Serkis giving it a go in his audiobook reading of Lord of the Rings, which is essentially definitive, I think, at this point. There had been earlier ones, and of course there'll always be unofficial ones, but I think Serkis doing, I think, his very best throughout the entirety of the book, and bringing different voices to characters, and very importantly, not simply replicating his co-stars in the adaptations, who try and give everyone their own distinct voices and distinct approaches, I think, as a way to sort of finally make that work as an interpretation. But notably, it has to work essentially as, again, a spoken word thing, as opposed to visually depicting it, or even sonically depicting it beyond the reading of a story. But that sort of loops into more Bombadil stuff. Getting back to the Scouring and why it not being there. I mean, again, a loss because it's a very rich part of the book. We've done an episode on it, and we touched on it in various other episodes too. The whole idea is that you've come back changed. You're no longer who you were. These are things directly stated in the text. There's no, that's an X equals X type moment. But what's interesting about it and is kind of more along the lines of what it, I don't want to say unintentionally reveals, but sort of cleverly reveals about, again, reductive readings of him. It's interesting that the first reaction, the first thing the hobbits see when they come back to the Shire is, above all, a gate, a ward house. These sort of like, this rules the idea of this, everything is sort of now more structured, militarized, and everything's sort of, cruddy along the way. And that's what they react to first, and our returning hobbits hate it out of the gate. There's no like, oh, I guess this is what we're doing now. It's like, no. And specifically, it's that element. It would have been different if they came back in and there was nothing like that, but then they sort of felt things were differently weird, or maybe sensed it was sort of different. No, it was the externalization and the implications of that reacted to. And something that Tolkien himself liked to say, he said he considered himself a bit of a Tory anarchist, although he had problems with the Tories too.
It's a great combo.
It's a great combo because it seems to make no sense. But he had real problems with the Tories. Reading the letters of Tolkien in the new book version of it that came out last year, especially his feelings immediately in the wake of World War II, were really fascinating. He was not somebody who was a triumphant, like, oh, great, our side won. He was more sort of like, boy, our side really sucks too. And, he had no time for the Nazis. He had no time for any of that. But he was really, really about all the winners as well. And more than one person has argued that's exactly what the Scouring is about. He was not quite so reductive, but
yeah, it's tremendously nostalgic for a vision of the English countryside that doesn't exist for a lot of reasons, right, at that point.
Yeah. And so that was, our latest episode was on nostalgia and how that works. I won't repeat it all here, but there's very much that factor. So yeah, he called himself an anarchist in the sense that, as he's put it, he says, not one of those whiskered men who go around blowing up things. And that sounds flippant, but it's important to remember that when Tolkien was very young, in the pre-World War I years, he would have grown up, the anarchists of the late 19th century, early 20th century were the modern quote-unquote terrorists of today, however you define them. They were the bogeyman. They were the label that you stuck on people, and there were a lot of assassinations and there were a lot of killings. So he was always distinct to himself as saying, well, I'm not that, but, government kind of sucks. And he would explain it from that point of view. And again, you can see where the libertarian aspect comes in, but he clearly wasn't fond of that either. Again, everyone's sort of like trying to grab onto aspects of him that don't quite play out.
He's clearly a monarchist.
He's a monarchist, but not, because on the one hand, yeah, you've got The Return of the King. But at the same time, his ideal society isn't Gondor. It's clearly the Shire. And they function within a kingdom, but it's notable that he has everything carved out.
There's a king, but the king is far away, right? So it's all about the local politics.
The king is far away, and the king very, very specifically, and carves this out in the appendices, that no men are allowed in the Shire. Even he won't go in the Shire. The land is their own and not his. That's something that's repeated at various points.
It's almost like a soap bubble, or almost this kind of like island within the larger world, right?
Exactly. So if anywhere is ideal, it seems to be there. That's my read on it. I don't think even a reunited kingdom, as is the case at the end of Return of the King, is Tolkien's idea of an ideal society. I think that plays out with the fact that he did try and write an initial sequel, had a hair of an idea, and wrote out some pages of it set in Gondor a generation or two later, but he abandoned it because he's like, nope, it's not working. This doesn't work. I can see why too. It's just something that even though he had some interesting images in it, it just wasn't going to fly.
Let me ask you a question. We were talking a lot about endings and so on. And of course, of the many endings of the Lord of the Rings and of the Return of the King in particular, it's the appendices. And I'm thinking about, your own work. I'm assuming libraries, archives, archival documents are things that, you have a passion for or even interest in. Tell me what you think about the appendices. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about them. I absolutely love the appendices.
Oh, I deeply love them. I mean, it's easily Tolkien's own scholarliness coming in. It's he would have been, if he had fully gone for it, he would have absolutely David Foster Wallaced his entire book in advance if he could. And part of him, if he had come around now, he'd be like, oh man, I'm totally doing this, and things like this, and then people would just say he was just ripping off Wallace. But it's this whole idea of creating the fictive nature. We're again trying to make it seem like fact.
Well, it's so rich and so layered. It's almost like he imagines the world first and builds the apparatus for it and the languages and all that stuff. And then the Lord of the Rings narrative is kind of like almost like the icing on the cake. Not that it's superfluous, but it's like the world is already there.
It's weird because it's really the reverse. I mean, many characters essentially emerge because they just emerge, and Tolkien basically, as we now see, because again, all the manuscripts are very much been annotated and published, we can pretty much see his creative process thoroughly. Marquette has also made that material more available online. It's all right there. Is that he'll be writing a story and all of a sudden a character appears out of nowhere and he's like, what did I do here? And then he basically has to sort of elaborate and try and get into why this character's here or why they're going to a certain spot. So the world building is it's flippant to say world discovering, but it's world creating rather than building.
Well, that's the sense you get though, right? Like that world is there and he just has to like connect the dots. I mean, I know actually in practice, like he's making this stuff up, but like it feels like it's out there and he's just like, oh, that's, as if he's just finding the trail that was always there anyway.
Well, his advantage too is that, and he talked about this, is that this is not a case where he wrote it down once, sort of cleaned it up and then, was done with it, is that he went back and obsessively rewrote, especially the earlier parts of the book, which he did many more times than he did the later parts, partially because as he went along, he realized, oh, okay, I need to make sure I sort of, understand this, put this in the setting, sort of put things in. And as a result, what we see as sort of like a clean, boy, he had all these things already in place, was more him going back and going, better include this. He's sort of internally retconning where nobody could see the join. And that is vitally important. I mean, he had to externally do that too. He had to change The Hobbit because The Hobbit as published did not match with what The Ring turned out to be. And so he had to sort of fudge that first and include even a bit in the story, of course, about why it was fudged, because the idea was that it was...
Yeah, it all hangs together, right?
Right, yeah. So there's that little trick too. But again, that's what you can do with The Hobbit because it's separate. With Lord of the Rings, you read it as it stands, you're like, oh, and it's only after the fact you realize, oh, wow, it went all over the place. I mean, Aragorn was originally Trotter the Hobbit. I mean, and all sorts of odd little things happened along the way.
One of the questions I always love to ask is about favorite parts or parts that most speak to you. And that could be like, obviously, which one of the three books, but it could also be, are there sections of Return of the King that really speak to you or really like you always think of? Or, we all have, when we open the book, the places the book falls open to. How is that for you?
Well, it's, for me, the all-time moment in the entire three books is not in Return of the King, it's in Two Towers. And it's something that Jackson did not film. And it would have, his restructuring of this part of the story wouldn't have allowed for it anyway. But it's the part where on the way to Cirith Ungol in Shelob's lair, where Sam and Frodo fall asleep and they're just isolated and alone, and even Gollum's gone for the moment. And then Gollum comes back, and for a moment there, Gollum may regret what he's done, but then Sam accidentally spoils the moment by reacting badly, and it's a very human situation. Things go skew if at just the wrong time when things might have been otherwise. And so that would be my all-time favorite moment, easily.
That's the passage, right, where he says something like, if someone were there to see, they would see what looked like a very, very old hobbit who's sort of almost reaching out, and, this like incredibly pathetic sight. And then Sam wakes up and responds aggressively, and it's like, like the bubble has burst. It's like such a tragic moment. It's such a sad moment.
But that's a Two Towers moment. So if we're talking Return of the King, many, many different moments. To refer to your discussion in the episode, okay. So I will argue for John Noble as Denethor this way.
Good luck.
The screenplay did him. The screenplay does the character dirty. No lie. The actor is excellent. John Noble really does his best with the way.
I would agree with that. Yeah. I would totally agree with that.
But the Denethor of the book, and I'll back up and say, I even did that tomato scene in terms of building up tension, beautifully done. And I will add that people tend to think of that, obsessively eating and things like this, but it's the build up to it, which is taken directly from the book. That's one of the sections. That is, the dialogue is all from the book, and so is the intent of it, where it's Faramir and Denethor saying what they may think is their final farewell, and that will depend on the manner of your return. It's like, that's a cold, hard moment, no matter how you encounter it, and brilliantly so, sadly, because it's power. But the Denethor of the book, it's fascinating to sort of see the sense of, whereas John Noble plays him a little more explosively at moments and earlier on, that sense in the book that Denethor is born one of very icy control, and how the sort of like that tension about how he faces off with Gandalf is really, really good. You mentioned, of course, the Pippin and Burgle moment. Lovely sequence. I also like Baragond. I like the brief amount of a tour we get of Minas Tirith, the sense of what's out there. It puts in place. You suddenly feel like, oh, there is a society here. We live in society. And other moments, just sort of, leap to mind many different things. Sometimes it's something, visual imagery. You mentioned the famed thing about, Faramir and Eowyn basically on the brink of doom, as everyone's on the brink of doom. And, of course, the thing that pretty much any artist who has ever done, the wind blows out their hair and it mixes together. It's like, the great things like that. But there are also things like, Gimli being, terrified in the Paths of the Dead, trying to keep up with things, sort of like, just like how that's functioning for him, the sense of Dunharrow and the secret spot hidden against the mountains, but also the moments of joy and the moments of, you could say, light fun. I like one of my favorite moments is in Post the Fall of Sauron, we are in Minas Tirith, and all the elves have arrived, and the grand marriage is going to happen. And so now Éomer has now finally seen Galadriel for himself, as old Aaron, and they have that great little exchange.
And he's like, "Yeah, she's kind of pretty."
Yeah, it's sort of like things like this. Then I must go fetch for my axe. But also, again, the way that without it being the buddy comedy of the films that you have, where Legolas and Gimli walking around observing things, like them observing the city. It's like, there's things can go on here. It's sort of like, you get a sense of what are these other outside perspectives looking at this, and how they bring that in. There are many, many small moments, and I haven't even talked about all the ones in Mordor, really. The sense of what orc society seems to be, how people interact there within that, what it actually means. And you could say that the sort of big moments that are in Mordor, that are, you could say very loaded with intent, but very good. Like when the clouds sear away and there's a single star that shines through. But also just the moments, and again, I think this is where his war experience comes in, where it seems like there's nothing there, and then they hear, and it's this miserable, greasy pool of water, and it's like they would never drink it any other circumstance, but it's water. They will take it right now. This sense of, what it's a light way of showing what extremity can mean, and what want can mean, and how one reacts to it.
Mm-hmm. And it's so thrown into relief too by the ways in which they experience Ithilien in the latter parts of the Two Towers, where it's kind of desolate, but it's also got this kind of desolate loveliness to it. there's like fragments of what was there. And in a way that provides this kind of really powerful foil for when you get into Mordor, and it's like truly a wasteland.
Right, right. And it's something that it's, the part before the Black Gate is meant to represent as clearly as anything with the Dead Marshes, the actual waste of war. But the idea of Gorgoroth and the center of Mordor being like literal dead zone is really fascinating, precisely because, especially as we've all learned and seen now, the idea of wastes and things like this are sort of powerful in human history. These days, we now know very clearly it's like actually there's life everywhere in many different forms. What we seem to see as an empty wasteland usually has stuff going on in it, without it, hidden away, things like that, in many different areas. So it's an imaginative portrayal of something that doesn't actually exist, which is the whole point. It is an extreme push towards what would something be like if it really had no life except that which was suffered to exist there due to one overriding will. And it's really interesting, and it's really rare that you get in any story like this, especially with all the knockoffs, but other things like this, where our chief villain is mute, silent, green, never there, just a presence sensed only once directly by a flash seen by the hobbits as they approach near from the top of the tower, and that's it. It's it's hard to pull that off. It really is. Even Paradise Lost, we start with Satan. We don't do that here.
Yeah, it's an incredible kind of remoteness. I'm struck when you're speaking about that the ways in which people in Return of the King talk about what might come next for Mordor, like the idea that those lands being cleansed. That's the language they use, the language of cleaning. Whether they're talking about Ithilien, and even more so when they're talking about Mordor, it'll be many generations until that land is cleansed. And I think it's such an interesting turn of phrase. Like, is this dirtiness, like this desolate quality? In what sense is this filth? I find that language really interesting.
It's interesting. It's also, of course, very loaded. We talked about this in our Orc episode. Is the idea it's like, oh, okay, thou shalt not suffer them to live type stuff going on here. Oddly enough, even though I thoroughly despise the series, it is terrible. The Rings of Power got one thing vaguely right, is that it actually sort of foregrounded the idea, thanks to an invented character, but it was actually, probably, again, their best creative collective decision, basically facing off against Galadriel, where Galadriel clearly wants to commit genocide, and this character is like, but what if, and like, let's put this back on it there. Again, it was not perfectly handled, and another reason why I think the series completely is, disastrous is that having created probably the one most interesting character about it at the end of this most recent season, they've killed him off. It's like, now what are you going to do for the rest of these? But that's another rant. But one thing I always thought was interesting was the idea that we see this part of Mordor, and it seems like it's all this. And yet, in both the map and in other mentions along the way, and including a mention, after the fact when the peace is being settled with Sauron's departure, is that in the distance in Mordor is a bitter inland sea, the equivalent like the Dead Sea of the Great Salt Lake. And the idea is that that's apparently where farms exist. They're, at the time, they're controlled by Sauron, who basically is overseeing, what appears to be, a huge society of slaves. And the idea is that they are given that land to be theirs. The presumption being is like, oh, so that land is apparently fertile and can be, so there's not everything in Mordor is complete disaster zone. So that's interesting too. The idea is sort of like, it's arguably, the munificence of the victor going like, you can do whatever you want over there, but nonetheless, I think that's an interesting factor.
That was another thing that really struck me on this read was both, as you say, like they're going into Mount Doom and you get the sense of like Mount Doom is in the center of Mordor. They've got to walk all the way into the middle. And you look at the map, it's like barely right inside it.
Right.
I mean, I guess it takes a couple of days and they're doing it under unideal circumstances, but still, it's not that deep into Mordor. So that sense of space and the way that that's playing out in terms of, how important this is versus how actually far away it is, or how central it is rather to Mordor itself, is one thing. And then the other thing is that while they're in Mordor, they encounter both the armies passing by and then also the way that those armies were supplied with food and water. They come across the big sort of casks and scrape out what little water is left from them and so forth. And this idea that, there are still systems that are feeding all of these orcs and other creatures that are part of the assembled forces. That there is some sense of like logistics going on here that has to be thought through is interesting, both in terms of like that it's there, that there are other things that you're saying that are suggesting what might be going on here behind the scenes, but also that it's not just magicked away, right? There's some actual infrastructure. There's some actual, again, sort of thought and humanizing, in a sense, going on behind these armies.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that we get, it starts, but particularly, there are examples of it throughout the Two Towers, various orc discussions, internal orc discussions, you could say, but it continues in Return of the King with various points, whether it's the two orcs that are, on their trail and then one kills the other, or whether it's the, the squad that they end up being folded into and things like this, and the idea that there's people going, the orcs are, dare I say, shown to be human because they're just like, crap, we're dealing with this again type stuff, and you can tell that there's not a lot of love lost for the people who put them in the situation, which I think is really one of the more interesting things about it, and also it again begs the question. It's like, does that mean they all deserve to die? Do they deserve to die? It's one of those things that makes it is sort of like, something that over time is something I think is worth grappling with more, and which I think Tolkien himself grappled with. That's why it's interesting to consider the last 20 years of his life. You could say just short of 20 years, which is post Lord of the Rings, when he was looking at what he created. He was doing at some point some very heavy rethinks about what he had done. The structure of the structure of the worlds that he had created, and also the implications of a lot of it. And some of it we attempted to rewrite, and some of it he got far with a certain rewriting. Other things he just couldn't make consistently work anymore, and other things he just was going like, I don't know. He just never got around to.
What are some of the things that he was most working to change? Like, what are the things you see his thinking being sort of most advanced?
Well, this is something that I think is an illustrative moment rather than a core moment. But I think what's something that's really interesting is how he basically realized, you could say, that if his creation myth involving elves and the way it's all set up the world, all that, he basically said, well, wait a minute, the elves, if they were that powerful and innate and could see everything, they could realize that the moon, for instance, is not some sort of blessed flower from Valinor floating over, which it is. It's actually this cold, dead world. And so he made it more a sign of Morgoth's malice at one point. I don't think he stuck with it, but I remember that being later on. But one of the other things he did, and this delves into stuff that, again, this is stuff that was only published after he died. On the one hand, there was part of his early sort of what became the Silmarillion. Some of the work he worked on rewriting some of the stuff around that. Basically, you could argue, I hate to say it was sort of like in reaction to things like Vietnam, nothing so simple, but it's suited the late 60s more than you might think in terms of a sheer sort of like about what was going on. And again, we're talking First Age, we're not talking Lord of the Rings. We're talking about the deep myth at that time only he really knew. And some of the character reactings to it and all that. And he was not necessarily arguing, for it in an anti-war sense, but it was more sort of like he was sort of incorporating sentiments and trying to find ways to puzzle things out. I'm speaking very, very broadly here. He didn't throw out a baby with the bathwater in this case, but he is sort of like, interrogating it a bit. I think it's telling, though, that his most, I don't want to say human story, that sounds flippant, but I think his most underrated story is a post-Lord of the Rings one, written in the early 60s. It was the only extended story he ever wrote beyond the basic history of Numenor, of the fabled paradise of men that fell in the Second Age after they became corrupt, etc., and which is referred to a number of times again. And Gondor is meant to be like the last surviving outpost of that particular culture. And what he did was he basically, having created as per his detailed, basic overviews and histories of Numenor, and as always, it'd be lovely if he included more, but we got what we got. And it's quite a bit of detail that surfaced after he died, and his son Christopher is organizing it. Is that in an early part of the dynastic succession of this island kingdom? So it's about 3-4 kings in, I think, or something like that from its founding. And basically, it's the idea of a crown prince who falls in love with a noblewoman. And you might think, okay, that's a typical enough story. However, it's not about successful marriage. It's about one that falls apart. And it goes into great detail on this front. It's a very, very somber and very, very reflective vision about a marriage that falls apart. Now, his own marriage was fine. as far as we know. He was married to Edith, his wife, for decades until she passed before him a few years. His son, however, Christopher, the same one who I mentioned in his stuff, did go through a divorce around this time. And I think he might have been looking at this a sort of sense of, okay, and by bringing in this type of thing that this type of situation where something falls apart and putting it in the world of Middle Earth, I'm not saying he's just simply transferring it all there, but what he does do is he also intertwines it with meditations on, you could say, creativity, activity, the idea of what people are driven to do. What is it better for someone to be driving out there and going out and doing things, or is it better to in fact be more domestic and sort of focus on things? You could argue there's a bit of gender essentialism going on, and unsurprising with Tolkien, but what's fascinating really with the story is that he doesn't in the end come down on the side that one side or the other was right. And there's a kid as well. There's a young kid, and it's about torn situations about who would go for it. It's very, again, it's one of those things that whenever people say Tolkien stories boring, good versus evil, it's like the nuance is there. Sometimes you have to find it. And most people, if they read this story, would be like, I would never have expected this from Tolkien, precisely because there are no heroes and there is no final victory. It's more sort of like people are reacting as they are. Tensions build to a point where something is ultimately irreparable and there is no happy ending. A society and life goes on, but there is no happy ending for this couple, for this family.
What's the name of the characters or the story?
The story is called The Mariner's Wife. The characters are called Aldarion and Arendis, and you can find it in two spots. You can find it in Unfinished Tales, which is where it was originally published, and you can find it in the new overall compendium of Second Age material that Brian Sibley put together a couple of years ago, called The Fall of Numenor, which is as close to a Second Age history in one place, stitched together from many different sources. But if someone's sort of like, I want to know more about this, and I don't want to read through all the footnotes and everything, it's like, okay, go read Fall of Numenor, because that story forms the core of what's in there, along with other writings and things like that.
And I believe you guys have done an entire episode about that story?
Yes, that was our 4th episode, and that's where I think the podcast actually clicked for the first time. It's sort of like we figured out how we wanted to do it at that point. And I sort of regard that, the first 3 episodes are us finding our feet. The 4th one, that one is the one that's sort of like, here we go. And we took it from there.
Well, I am afraid we're about running out of time, but before we go, I guess I want to ask you one final question. As we've come to the end of The Lord of the Rings, let's say that a listener has read The Hobbit, perhaps, and read The Lord of the Rings. What would you recommend for them to read next? And maybe it's something of Tolkien's, or maybe it isn't.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, the obvious thing people do is sort of like, oh, well, what's the next thing you want to find out more about this? Like, this world is created. It's like, well, the Silmarillion, because that was the first posthumous publication. It was Christopher Tolkien trying to pull everything together and create essentially what was the Bible of Middle-earth, is kind of what it functions as. It's sort of like, oh, okay, this is how people, or at least these societies, saw themselves and saw their past and their histories. And it reduces and twists and ties a lot of different stuff into one spot. And I got a sense from Christopher Tolkien's writings later on in life that he almost regretted doing it, because it's sort of like it sort of reduced everything down, but at the same time it's sort of handy. So famously, Tolkien himself realized, even though he wanted to get it published and try to get it published in its earlier forms, well before he even succeeded with Hobbit and things like this, he was sort of making moves on this, or initially making guesses at it. He basically told someone in a letter saying, like, the problem with this material is that it's too much high style, no hobbits. He recognized that the hobbits were a way in for people, something that's sort of recognizable. It's like, oh, casual film, sort of exploring the world together, as opposed to something where it's sort of like, this is the way. It's like, where am I? And I love it. And I loved it because it was the first thing I read after Lord of the Rings back when I was 13, and sort of took it on board. But is it going to work for everybody? The Lord of the Rings doesn't even work for everybody. If all you ever read is The Hobbit, I'm not surprised. If you only just made it through Lord of the Rings, you're like, that was pretty good, but boy, I'm glad I had the films. Don't bother with Silmarillion, trust me. If you're looking for something beyond Tolkien, though, a sort of where to go to, I would say, if we're talking about books, I'll suggest 2. One is a slightly earlier contemporary of Tolkien's, and one is something much more modern. I will add as well that, of course, you should read my co-host Jared Pekachek's book, The West Passage, because, of course. So this goes without saying. So, but having said that about his, the 2 books I would suggest, first is I would suggest reading E.R. Edison was often the one people say, like, oh, if you want pre-Tolkien fantasy, go to him. Problem was he was essentially a fascist. So I would not recommend that right now. Instead, I would recommend Lord Dunsany. And I would recommend his very fascinating and very interesting book, The King of Elfland's Daughter, which sounds like it might be sort of like a pretty little fantasy. It's not that. It's something else again. And it ends very mysteriously and very, very beautifully. And it's a very striking book. He wrote many different stories. He was very, very funny. He could be very wry. He has a certain, I don't want to say more earthiness, but something more to him that Tolkien didn't quite have. But The King of Elfland's Daughter is really remarkable, and I think is very underrated. I would suggest for something later, and there are many different writers these days, especially this century, that I could just name all over the place. N.K. Jemisin is a very obvious one. R.K. Quang, there's Marlon James is another good example. Many different writers who sort of touch back on the earlier point are going like, okay, let's get out of Europe. Let's get out of Europe and let's, go do something else and try and look at society. And someone like Ursula K. Le Guin and the Earthsea books does an incredible job of that. So I would recommend that as well. So I would easily recommend all these. If there's something though, and this goes back to when I was reading Lord of the Rings for the first time and reading these other things I was mentioning. I mentioned Dune, I mentioned McCaffrey, I mentioned other things I was reading. The one other fantasy series from that time that was published later, not by much, but a few years later, that has stuck with me, and images have absolutely stuck with me since then, would be Lloyd Alexander's story, Chronicles of Prydain, which gained most fame as being seemingly for young adults. Yes, the main protagonists are young adults, there's no question, but they grow up over the course of the series. That's kind of the whole point. And the setting is not Wales. It's Welsh-based, but it's not Wales. It draws on elements of Welsh mythology, but is not meant to simply replicate it. It's its own separate thing. And it is something that over the sweep of its 5 books, it builds out a story in slightly unexpected ways. It does things where it may be even more certainly trope-heavy, possibly, on certain fronts than even Lord of the Rings is. Arguably, our lead character, Taran, is a special boy. But what's interesting about this particular special boy is that, unlike even Harry Potter or whatever and all that, is the whole point of where this particular special boy comes from is that, one, he's not that special, and two, when the great mystery is revealed, it's still not that special, and that's kind of the whole point. I'm not trying to give anything away here, but I think it's something where it ends with beautiful, beautiful melancholy and beautiful uneasiness, where there's a happy ending, but there is so much loss by the time you get there. And that's something that I think Tolkien also conveys in his own way. And here, I think it's even more, I don't want to say absolute, but more noticeable. And I don't know if the difference is that, Tolkien's an English writer on home turf, whereas Lloyd Alexander is coming from America, served in World War II, fell in love with the Welsh countryside, decided to pursue things in different ways. But that is not what I would call a cozy fantasy in the end. There are cozy moments, but it's not a cozy fantasy. And I think it's very underrated. And I think the Disney adaptation in the mid-'80s did it an incredible disservice. But real heads know, as they say. It's always been interesting to find people who still appreciate Prydain and still love and respect that work, because it's really remarkable.
Wonderful. Well, you've given us several directions to face if we want to travel on from this book, and that's lovely. So thank you for that, and thank you for stopping by and chatting with us and getting into some of the real nitty-gritty about this book and this author with us. We will have links in the show notes for where you can find and follow things that Ned is up to. But in the meantime, listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We'd love to hear from you. We are also on Blue Sky now, so just search for the Spouter-Inn there and you'll find us. And this show is made possible by people like you supporting us on Patreon. Patrons, you'll get to hang out with us in a friendly Discord, and you can find out more at patreon.com/megaphonic. And show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/76B. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.